Okay, looks like we're recording.
Just 1 second. Let me just confirm that it's streaming on YouTube.
I just got a little pop-up that says webinar is now streaming live on YouTube.
You're correct. Go ahead.
That's a good sign.
So don't believe everything you see online. All right, well, welcome back, everybody. We have concluded the public comment section of the PRRC. The stated purpose of the governor's executive order under which we have convened is to reform and reinvent policing. But so many of the comments received so far go well beyond policing. Starting from the first night and continuing through, we heard pleas for a wide range of things outside of policing. Diversion programs, reentry programs, youth programs, community centers, better housing, job training, mental health crisis response teams, better means of communicating the various programs that are available, and on and on. And Tamara has compiled all of the comments that we received over the preceding 4 weeks, and we'll be sharing that with you as a working paper. Technically, these are not part of our mandate, but they are all interrelated with our criminal justice and policing system. To those who are hoping to defund the police, addressing these issues is the means by which we will someday see the need for fewer policing resources. These issues need to be addressed, but addressing them requires an ongoing commitment by our community. Those on this committee and others who are not need to be part of that discussion. I stated many times that this was not a process that would conclude on April 1st, and that is what I was referring to. The members of this committee were chosen not just because of what they could bring to the discussion of policing reform and reinvention, but because of what you can contribute to the resolution of these other larger social issues. The purpose before us right now is to present a plan for reform and reinvention. Tonight, we will begin discussion on what we have heard over the past 4 weeks. We have grouped the comments into 16 topics across 4 thematic areas. The lines between them are not always sharp. There is quite a bit of overlap. At this point, I will turn the meeting over to Tamara to guide us through tonight's discussion.
So John, if we could pull up the agenda and take a look at that first. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be here with you. We've had a number of affinity group meetings, listening sessions, as the mayor said, and tonight is really about some working time for the committee to share what did you hear, what do you see as the priorities in the near term, in the long term. If you work with an agency, what might you be able to bring to the table? What ideas do you have? And so what we've done is we've taken all of the emails that have come in and the recommendations that came from the affinity group meetings. And as the mayor said, we put that into kind of some thematic groupings. And we'd like to ask you about, do we have those thematic groupings? Are they all represented? Were there other things that you heard? And then we have a series of questions that we'd like to go through. So John, I don't know if you're able to pull up the deck. Okay. So we've had the opening comments from the mayor. As far as process guidelines go, you know, if you can be muted when you're not speaking, and you know that it's *6 if you're on a phone. And just for those of you that may be out there listening, this is being recorded. It's live streamed right now on YouTube, and it will be posted on the website so that you'll be able to view it after the fact. So you can see the questions here for the committee discussion. We'd like to use about an hour and 15 minutes or so to have some discussion together around what did you hear as some key priorities, again, in the near and the long term, And what ideas do you have for the plan? Are there things that your agency can bring to the table? Where do we have to consider budget and resources? Where are, budget and resource needs is a component of the plan. And then what areas do you think are needed for further exploration? So if we go to the next slide, again, what you see here is really themes and a first attempt at looking at themes across the top with the blue, the darker blue, and then underneath it are what topics kind of fall under those themes. And something that we put across the top is we heard building trust was something that went through all the conversations that we had, that there is a real need to build stronger trust. So we didn't consider that so much a theme as something that goes throughout the whole of all the discussions we had. And then you'll see along the bottom, we said that as we go into the plan, there also will be a need for doing some measuring of results over time, perhaps doing a baseline survey and then having metrics that get shared over the course of time. But if you look at the darker blue themes, the first one that came up is really this systemic and macro view. As the mayor said in his opening comments, there are some things that are interrelated, but they might not be specifically around policing. We had a lot of comments that came in that talked about that macro view. Then there were comments around policy and procedure, workforce development or the police department personnel. Transparency was a very large theme that we heard. And then also this idea around prevention and connection. How can the community work together to solve some of those kind of larger questions? So the first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted just to, and you'll see in this kind of white box down in the bottom left are the series of questions. Is there anything that you would add to this that you think you heard that's not represented here? And then we can start to kind of delve into some of those other questions around what you saw as the near and longer term priorities. You're going to notice that in the center under police department personnel, there's like a little orange star on a couple of the boxes. We would like to have another committee meeting this Wednesday evening. And we've invited Fred Miller to come and speak. Khalil Jameson has been engaged to do some work with the police department over a 2-year period. And we have asked Fred if he would come and speak to that engagement along with the mayor and Chief Owens. So there are a couple of boxes here around ongoing education, aligning culture and values, and something that came up around the racial bias audit that we'd like to kind of hold until Wednesday to have some more committee time to talk about those pieces after we hear from Fred. He's going to share some information with the committee. So for tonight's meeting, we'd like to go ahead and start with policy and procedure and open it up to the committee if you have thoughts around what you heard. So why don't we start under the policy and procedure kind of theme as our starting point. And you'll also notice that the policy and procedure and the personnel are kind of internal workings of the police department. And then the transparency and the prevention are kind of more those outward facing community aspects. And then the systemic macro view is kind of the context of where all of this fits under. So why don't I stop there, and if you can use the raise hand, and let's start under the policy and procedure. And again, if there's something that you think is missing. Kevin?
Highlighting the what the Justice Center of Rensselaer County brought up, one of our earliest affinity groups, the right to know, that the right to know officers' names, right to know if people are being questioned, the reasons for stopping, questioning, and detaining police officers not covering up their badge information, and announcing prior to search. And I have a question about that one. If there's any, is there any justification about police being in the role of not announcing prior to search, and that the individual must give voluntary, knowing and intelligent consent and can respond no. So I certainly have questions about that one in particular. I don't know if the chief can respond to that last part.
Sure, Kevin. Were you speaking about like a search warrant or a search of a person?
Well, police to search of person or property. So one of their requests was that police officers announce prior to any search of person or property that is not part of an arrest, and that the individual must give voluntary, knowing, and intelligent consent and can respond no.
So I'm trying to think of some examples. For example, like a car stop or a field interview where a person is contacted, they're not under arrest, but the officer may want to search a person for weapons. I could see that as a possibility. So obviously, anytime that we can convey the reason for our interaction, that's always a beneficial thing to do, as long as we're not encountering resistance or there's not an arrest being affected at the time, because it's just better for everyone involved to have a full understanding of the situation. So we do that. If that was pointed out because there's times where that hasn't happened, well, certainly that's a training issue on our end to make sure that if a search is going to be conducted, we notify the person. A lot of times, if it's not the search of a person at a scene, if it's a search of property, for example, a vehicle that doesn't meet the search warrant requirement or the exceptions to the search warrant, same thing with real property, a home or apartment, something like that. We have a consent form, an actual physical printed form that we provide. We ask the person, it has that information. They can say no at any point, even after they've said yes. And so we do that for those types of searches. As far as identification of officers, absolutely. We identify officers by a badge number, a badge itself. Depending on the uniform they're wearing, they might have a metal name tag that's affixed near the badge, or it might be embroidered on the panel of the uniform shirt or the outside vest carrier. So yeah, those are things that happen. If the point of bringing that up was to say that we're not doing them often or doing them all the time, that's a training issue, but we have those identified in policy already.
Great, thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
John, do we need to have I should just ask the committee, do you prefer to have the slide up, or do you? Okay.
I'll just leave it up.
Okay. I know it's hard because then you can't see each other as well, but. Are there other thoughts under the policy and procedure, things that stood out to you as a committee member, or ideas that you have?
This is Kathy. I have a question. Is walking detail the same as community policing?
I suppose it could be. I know that's come up in how we define community policing. And so we look at it from the department is it's our engagement with the community. So our partnerships with the community, how we organize our department to be able to better interact with the community, and then problem solving. So that's what I think of community policing. Now, in my experience, a lot of times when people talk about community policing, it seems like they focus on the beat cop, the walking officers in their neighborhood. And that is a wonderful thing when the opportunity is to have people walking, police officers walking in a neighborhood. It gets the officers out of the car. There's more direct interaction, obviously depending on the weather in the neighborhood, but it's not always possible to do that. So I would say that walking posts, or the beat cop, if you will, is a component of community policing. It's just a way in which we can, as a philosophy, spread community policing by walking. But it's not, in my opinion, community policing is not limited to that, although I think that's the common thought when people think of community policing. That's either the officer that's walking the neighborhood, or a little wider than that is an officer that's just assigned to one neighborhood. The way we deploy our personnel, we have 4 patrol zones across the city, 2 officers at a minimum assigned to each zone. And that's across 3 shifts, obviously. And then each day of the week. So we work 5-day work week. So we have days off. So you may not always have the exact same officer every single day or every single time of day, where we have community police officers assigned out of our community services bureau. They have a little bit more flexibility in the sense that they're not assigned to answer calls. So they can go to the neighborhood group meetings. They can address the quality of life issues a little more in depth than maybe the zone officers, which are responding to calls. So I think as we look at community policing, we try to incorporate it as a philosophy throughout the department. As a unit, we do have a community policing unit, which right now is 2 members out of the larger community services bureau. We'd like to increase that to at least have 1 CPU officer per zone, so 1 for each of the zones. I think people like having just a single name or maybe a single phone number or email to remember for that community policing officer. It's assigned to their neighborhood or assigned to their, right now they're assigned to basically half the city. 1 is north and 1 is south. So walking posts are a part of community policing, but I think community policing is much bigger than that.
So community policing was an idea that was really emphasized several times, as I recall. And I'm trying to figure out where that is on the grid. I see PD and community relationship building in the last column. But I'm wondering if it also may belong under policy and procedure.
We can add that, Kathy.
Okay, thanks.
Chief Owens, where do you think it would be the best place from a thematic?
I think as you and the mayor and others have pointed out, a lot of these spread across the different columns. So it's definitely under PD and community, so in the prevention and connection, but it could be under procedure because it's a process we use to spread the philosophy of community policing, those walking details. But I think PD and community, it's probably captured there if we want to just actually spell it out as community policing within that category.
Okay. Laura?
Thanks. So I'm just looking down the list, and policy and procedure wise, I know that the police department has several policies, and the chief mentioned a lot of them that are already in existence and address a lot of the things that people were concerned about. So, making people aware that they exist, I think, will be a big part of building the trust. And my thought on procedural justice is along those lines. I mean, people should know or should be made aware that police have things they can do and can't do. And just like you mentioned with searches, There's times you can search and consent and all types of things that officers consider. And when someone gets stopped on the east side, north central, Miami Beach Estates, wherever they are, no matter where they are in the city of Troy, the police follow the same procedure. With that type of issue or an arrest, and so I know there's across the board expected behaviors on the rules and regulations and I just think communicating that to the public to build the trust that everyone is being treated fairly, I think would go a long way. And back to the search, if I could for a second, probation does searches on people we supervise. So we go into people's houses, and even there, they have a condition of probation to submit to a search, but they have a choice whether they want to allow us to do that if we have a reason to do it. And I mean, if they say no, it's it could be they're in violation of the probation, frankly. But there are times when we might be out on a give detailer with the Troy Police as our agent. So they might be just kind of following our process, not necessarily making that determination to assist with a search. So I just wanted to make that comment. And I think that's it on that topic.
Laura, can I just ask you one question before we go over to Renee? The procedural justice, if you look over all the way to the far right under prevention and connection, there was also this box around procedural justice education. Do you have any thoughts on where you think that fits?
Well, probably in the, in transparency and probably under transparency.
I was thinking about more like who would do that.
Oh, who would do it?
As far as like the education around procedural justice.
Well, it depends on how we would approach improving the relations in the neighborhoods, whether it's if we have continued conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And we'll come back to that when we get to that, that section too. Okay. Renee? Renee, you might be on mute.
Okay, I apologize. I was on mute. So in looking at the chart here, all of these things look fine and well, and especially the part about accountability. And as the chief said, they have these policies and procedures in place, but when things don't go well, that's a violation of the policy and procedures. And so I think a little more discussion needs to be had about how officers will be held accountable for violating those policies and procedures. And one of the things that I don't see here is the union mentioned in here as well, because I believe in one of the discussions it came up that the union has a big role in how officers are managed, and I'll leave it at that.
As far as our policies and procedures, we refer to them as general orders, so it encompasses both policies and procedures. We have over 100. As we have mentioned, the Detroit Police Department is a New York State accredited agency. Part of that accreditation process through the Division of Criminal Justice Services is a review of our policies and procedures, and they follow best practices and state guidance regarding policies and procedures, particular to violations of the general orders. It depends on what it is. It could be a minor infraction. And again, to just back up a little, the policies and procedures, our general orders, they're guidelines. There's no possible way they could account for every variation of the circumstances our members are going to face. So the general orders give that guidance. When our members deviate from that guidance, we try to understand what was the reason for it. Does it require retraining? Is it a discipline issue? Within discipline, we subscribe to a progressive discipline. So for an initial minor infraction, it might be a verbal counseling, and then it'll progress up through ultimately including potentially termination, depending on the violation, the history involved with the member, particular to the union members. So I know it's discussed as union members, but for the police department, there's two unions, the PBA and Coats. The PBA represents patrolmen and sergeants. Coats represents the captains. They're the unions that are involved in collective bargaining for their members. But all of those union members are our members, the police department members. They're our employees as well. So while unions certainly are a level of protection, a labor right, the police department, so the administration, and certainly the city administration, we have management rights as well. What we've found, or what I found in this role, is any opportunity we have to work together, because the members, the union members, also our department members, are the ones that are being asked to do the job, to go out and do what's asked of them, by the law, by the administration of the police department, by the elected officials in the city, by the community members. And so I wouldn't say that the union has any more rights, or definitely they do not have authority over the police department, but they are the collective bargaining arm for employees to have certain rights. And so I've seen personally people in positions of power can abuse their authority. And so the union does provide a level of protection. And at the times where we might consider that the union is fighting the police department of the city to protect a member, at the time that they're defending that member, the member is accused of some infraction or wrongdoing. And so they have, as employees and citizens, they have due process rights as well. So we want to make sure that things are being followed and the system is fair. Was that helpful, or am I missing part of the question?
No, that's very helpful. And I think, going back to what Laura was saying, that kind of information, some of this was new information to me, or just the concept of it, and communicating that to the community will be very helpful. And also, just dealing with the optics, because at face, it looks like the union has more authority, but based on what you just said, that's a different perception of what I've had, just from observation. So I think more communication about that needs to be had. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other thoughts around the policy and procedure for right now, or do we want to move to the next police department personnel?
Tamara, I can't figure out how to raise my hand. So I was trying to raise my hand like this way.
Okay. Yeah, just call out, Chris, if that happens. You go right ahead.
It doesn't seem to be. I'm not sure that this might not be covered on Wednesday, and we can talk about my concern here in more depth then, but I'm worried that we are fooling ourselves if we think communicating to the public that the procedures are treated exactly the same, whether it's a person in a white community or a black community or wherever. I think we're fooling ourselves. What has to happen is there has to be a change in reality on the ground. There has to be a change in the way it's actually carried out. And I think we can probably talk about that a lot more on Wednesday, but I just want to have said that. I think that we're going to gain trust by telling people that the procedures are treated equally is just completely fooling ourselves, because people know differently on the ground, what actually happens. That's not to say that the procedures aren't taught the same way. That's not to say that the procedures aren't meant to be applied equally. But there's, based on everything that we heard, we didn't hear people come forward and say, in the east side of town, we've had a lot of different incidents of people being treated with excessive force, or anything else. So there's something different happening on the ground, and if we don't get at that, we're going to be missing, I think, perhaps the most important thing that we were hearing.
Thank you, Chris. Does anyone have any thoughts on that, or?
Tamara?
Yes.
So, Chris, I'm going to push back a little bit on you. We heard some isolated incidents that were brought to the table through this process. We didn't hear of widespread issues with the department. At least I didn't hear those. So while I understand what you're saying, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that our police department has probably a pretty great relationship with a majority of the community. So I want to make sure that we're careful in making sure that what was presented and said then versus, creating it a little bit bigger than what's done. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. Okay. And I'm not at all saying that, but I really want to make sure that I think a lot more people have good relationships with the police department versus bad relationships with the department. And I also want to go back to the union.
Can I just talk about that before you move on? First of all, I completely agree that a lot more people have good relationships with the police than don't. What I'm talking about here is not specific to the Troy Police Department. This would be true everywhere, and not just in police departments, but everywhere. What actually happens on the ground, and that's the part about racial bias that we don't even see. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that doesn't exist in the Troy Police Department, just like it doesn't exist everywhere else. It's not saying the Troy Police Department is worse than other police departments or even worse than any of our organizations. It's just saying we can't go out and tell the community the procedures are treated equally when they see something different. And they're treated differently everywhere. People of color are treated differently. And we're fooling ourselves if we don't think that's the case. We're blind to it because it doesn't happen to us. We don't experience it. But I mean, it's well known and well documented and well talked about, and most places are doing thorough, deep investigations into that so they can understand it themselves and do something about it. And we can't work around that. I think we're missing something really important here.
And this plan is about Troy, not Albany, not Schenectady, not other places, but this plan is about Troy. So we need to remember that as well too. Yes,
and Troy is no different than any place else, is what I'm saying. Everybody is experiencing this. And we keep, talking in these terms. We're all these white people here talking about, we're just missing something really critical here that that we need to do some work on and understand. We're all good people. We all caring people. We have good policies and good practices that, if applied equally, would be fine. But on the ground, they're not applied equally. A racial bias audit would show that for any of our organizations. So I'm not pointing out the Troy Police Department. I'm saying we're all that way. I've been saying that from the beginning, and we've got to get at that, or nothing's going to change.
Chris, I appreciate what you're saying. Sorry.
Go ahead, and then Chief Owens, go ahead, and then let's go to Renee next.
I appreciate what you're saying, Chris, and I understand that. And if there's examples or incidents of what you're talking about that were raised, we understand that. I'm not dismissing those, but when we respond, our officers are reacting to the circumstances and the actions of others at the time. And so we respond. I don't know, maybe I have a hard time because I don't judge people by color. I'm not responding to people based on color, skin, or race. And so when we respond to, and if we're talking about people of color or minorities are being treated differently, we're not treating the victims any differently based on color or skin. We're not treating the suspects any differently on the skin. Now, I'm not saying people haven't experienced that before, and those are important to hear about in the context of historical reasons. But I don't think on the ground, when our officers are going out, they're not making decisions based on race. I truly believe that, and I'll take the heat and I'll take pushback from people that say that's not the case. But I see it when they go out, and regardless of the person they're interacting with, they're responding to what's in front of them, what's happening, the actions of others.
So I doubt we're going to get anywhere on this conversation, but I've been stopped by the police a number of times for traffic infractions. I'm sorry to say. I have never had a police officer ask me or treat me in a way like they thought I was dangerous. Nobody ever asked me to get out of the car. Nobody ever asked me to put my arms out of the window to show that I didn't have an arm on me. I wasn't armed. They didn't act as if they were afraid. Implicit bias is about despite the fact that we don't even know it's happening. If I was a police officer, I would be doing it, because we grew up with this stuff in our head being told that Black people are dangerous. Don't go into a Black neighborhood. We all heard it. And it's in our heads. It's not conscious. So,
I was never told that.
Pardon?
I was never told that. I grew up in the city. I grew up in different neighborhoods and American people.
Okay.
I was never told that.
Yeah,
when our officers are responding, it's the actions of, in terms of a vehicle stop. What is the operator doing? Or what is their behavior? What is the call that they're going on? Is it in relation to a suspect from another crime? So there's other factors. It's not just simply based on, you said you were stopped and you didn't think the officers felt threatened or they didn't treat you differently. Well, there's other people that have been stopped that are treated the same as you as well.
Yes, but if you asked a Black person who's been stopped, let's say 20 times by a police officer, I would bet my bottom dollar that at least one of those times, where it never happened to me, there would be some way in which the officer approaching them treated them in a way that was different than they would treat a white person. It's
okay, fair enough.
It's just the way the world is. It's just the way the world is. And there's a lot of learning that if we really want to get at this, we'll all do some reading and deep reflection and understand that that's just the case. And if we're not doing that reading and understanding, then we're never going to get at this stuff.
So I'd like to go over to Renee and then DA Donnelly. Renee?
Yes. So I'd like to thank Chris for that, because you're hitting it right on the head. My experience as a Black woman is going to be different from a white person, and here in the city of Troy, in Rensselaer County, both my husband and I have experienced incidents with the police that were quite nerve-wracking. One had to do with, and this is for my husband, pulling into our community, which is in Brunswick Hills. And he was asked, what is he doing here? Not only that, but the officers pulled up to his car, hands on their guns, and wanted to know why was he in this community. Asked for his driver's license. And when they ran it, they said, okay, you can go. Threw it at him and told him to be careful. Now, the saving grace was that a neighbor saw this. My neighbor's a white man, and he asked him, what are you doing? I guess when they pulled his name up, they found out that he is an employee at RPI. Why they pulled him over, to this day, we don't know why he was pulled over. But that incident was not a good experience for him. It took a couple of days for me to even find out what happened, because I wasn't with him when it happened, but I ran into my neighbor and he asked me, is he okay? And then I got him to explain to me what happened. Those are our experiences. I even got pulled over coming up to Brunswick. And this is when I first came to the community. And Brian, I believe this is even before your term as police chief. But I was pulled over coming from the Stewart station down at Pauling. There was nothing wrong with my car. He never even said what the problem was. And my saving grace was that he wanted me to get out of the car. And I had just had knee surgery, so it took me forever to get out. He got frustrated with me and said, forget it, and left. And I'm like, what was that? Those are the kinds of experiences that I'm familiar with. So what Chris is saying is that those implicit biases are there. I know, Brian, you say you don't see color, and I believe you when you say that, but somewhere in the background, we all have our preferences, okay? Just like I have a preference over chocolate cake over strawberry cake. I like chocolate. That's just a preference. If I go in a room, that's where I'm going to gravitate to. So these kinds of things are built in, and as Chris says, we need to delve into this a little more. It's not just it doesn't happen just here in Troy. It's everywhere, but Troy is no exception to this situation. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Renee. DA Donnelly.
My comment was a little bit more basic. The conversation got a little bit deeper. I was just going to go back to something that I had said last week that I'd been thinking through as well, is what can be done so that when this perception or this reality of disparate treatment occurs, what can be done to help the community trust the explanation they receive? So that, as that relates to policy and procedure, and I don't have an answer, what can be built in that is going to assist when something does go wrong, when someone gets pulled over and, let's imagine it's not a worst case scenario, but someone gets pulled over, turns out they're the wrong person, and let's allow, maybe they get treated in a discourteous way, which is not okay. What can be in the policy and procedure that's going to engender a little bit of healing on part of the person who was inconvenienced by the police, mistreated by the police, that will allow the community to feel like they have some sort of recourse without it being, I'm trying to figure out if there's something that can, to allow the person to feel like they have some skin in the game. Do you know what I'm saying? Like an opportunity to be heard and to resolve it in maybe fashion so that it doesn't fester out of control. So I'm not really offering a solution. I think I was trying more to identify a separate issue under policy and procedure.
So could the answer for that be the fact that we actually have transparency around the policy and procedures so that they're actually visible?
That's
then,
kind of what I'm thinking.
Right.
Yeah, something to the effect of, someone comes in and is upset because ABC happened, to let them know in an effective and quick way, well, that is not what's supposed to happen. And this is how it's going to be rectified. And maybe put these small things to bed, like a means to put the small things to bed, so that we can deal with the larger issues. Because I often see things go out of control because people don't see the end result of whatever happened.
Well, and I also think it's also an explanation or visibility of the disciplinary process too, because, again, going back to that very individual decision that Renee spoke about, it's an individual interaction. And if it was one police officer or one sanitation worker, it's going to be an individual reaction. We can have all the audits done and all the policies and procedures and come back clean, and you still have to deal with an individual human being and their decision making at that point in time. So I think that the clarity of the disciplinary process probably is important as well too. And that kind of goes citywide. I mean, we hear issues citywide with other employees, but specific about this policy and this report, I would say that might be an option.
Because oftentimes someone just wants to know, you know what, that's not okay. That's not what we encourage. It happened because of XYZ, for whatever reason. So sometimes people just like to be heard. And I think, like you said, a public of the policy, I think would be very helpful.
So there's just a couple things that I heard there, this idea of wanting to be heard. And what do you do if something goes awry with the policy and a procedure? So some things to think about, because I think it comes back to that idea of trust that's going across the top. Let's go to Chief Owens and then Renee.
I just want to thank Renee for sharing her stories. I'm not discounting if those happen, and both of those are unacceptable from what you described. Sounds like one wasn't in Troy or maybe wasn't dealing with Detroit police, but in any event, as law enforcement professionals, that's not acceptable to treat people that way. So at a minimum, we want to know about things like that so we can address it. The complaint process, we are trying to make it easier in a way so that it can be done online or remotely. But one of the benefits, and I've seen it happen, is if a person comes in to make a complaint to the police station for something, minor like that, traffic stop. So they can come in, speak to the sergeant, speak to the captain a lot of times, and talk through the situation, the scenario that happened, and then maybe involve the officer who was on that call or however they mistreated the person, and address it at the time directly. For our members, sometimes they make mistakes. If they pull over the wrong car or they thought they saw something that didn't happen, our members need to be courteous and professional. That's the baseline. If they make a mistake or if something was not what they thought, then they need to make a genuine apology. I thought I saw you drive through the red light, and the person explains that they didn't. Okay, well then our officers need to be humble enough and to not take anything personal and just admit, okay, I thought I saw something that was wrong. And I'm saying that because I think we've gotten better at doing that. Our members now, I think, are more approachable than maybe in the past. I think they come across, hopefully, more personable. But will there be times where they make a mistake, or not even a mistake, where they do something wrong, that they're discourteous or they do something that they shouldn't have done? And so as we become aware of that, we want to address it. So I appreciate you sharing that story. And I wasn't meaning to suggest that these things don't happen or haven't happened.
Renee?
Yeah. I just wanted to acknowledge what Mary Pat said, that basically, and it's been my experience just talking with individuals in the city, understanding that when they make a complaint, that it won't be ignored. They won't be treated as though they're invisible or that they're not being heard. So, having that transparency and explaining what the process is to file a complaint, and then having those complaints accepted and respected. And when I say respected, I mean that this actually happened to the person. Of course, there will be an investigation to delve out whether or not there's any validity to it. But just to be able to come in and make those complaints, because when you go through a situation like that where basically you're afraid for your life, and for African Americans now to get pulled over by police or they're just following you, I'm afraid, and I haven't done anything. And so even when you get stopped and you have to address that issue, you have to deal with the humiliation that you experience behind that, because you didn't do anything. And I'm talking about those types of situations, not situations where, probably something did happen, but just on those basic situations where you have to deal with that humiliation, and you're trying to be a law-abiding citizen. I think just working through some of the things that we're doing here is a good first step. And as the mayor said, this is going to be an ongoing process. Chris has pointed out some good things that, we're dealing on surface stuff. Everyone has different experiences. I even have different experiences than some of the African Americans within my own community. Some things, I'm ignorant to, that they are experiencing. Like Brian says, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. I'm just not aware of it. And so we need to delve a little deeper into resolving some of these issues that may be causing community distress and oppression. Thanks.
Thank you, Renee. Laura?
Actually, my question or comment was answered by the chief and Renee and Mary Pat, really. I just wanted to comment that when police pull people over, if the opening remark would be, do you know why I pulled you over? And they should really have an answer for the person in the car. Whether it was speeding or a taillight or, police get information all the time, as do we, as to people who are under suspicion for different things in the Capital District. Maybe they look like somebody the police are told to look out for certain people who fit a description on something that happened in Syracuse, for God's sake. So anyway, you guys answered my question, and that might fall under the right to know statement, but thanks.
Let's go to Council President, and then if we can go to the next category after this comment, just so we can touch on each thing this evening.
Just to, first of all, very good conversation. As mentioned earlier, we heard a lot about trust and respect and treating people fairly with dignity and respect on both sides, police and, folks in the community with our police, and just that mutual respect and transparency and treating people fairly, equally. And to kind of dovetail what Mary Pat said, and Mary Pat, when you stated that, I was thinking the same thing. Is there anything we can do maybe in terms of just more procedural justice? And maybe, Brian might be able to talk about this a little, but just somehow giving the residents a voice where they feel that there is that equal respect, and also our police force. So just kind of my two thoughts on that note in terms of policy.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to, can we move to the next kind of theme around police department personnel? And again, some of this we'll touch upon when Fred comes on Wednesday. But are there some, what did you hear as key priorities in the near and long term in this area? And what ideas do you have? Renee?
On the personnel part, I do remember the Troy Coalition of Black Leaders stating that some of the community members would like or should have a role in the hiring process, or in the terms of interviewing officers that come through in preparation for serving the community, to make sure that that is a good fit, and just to have some input. The other thing I'd like to say is that recently the police department brought on I attended the ceremony for 4 young people, and in that group was one African-American male. And one of the things that I want to make sure, or that I state, is that I would like to see when you bring officers that are not traditional, meaning a white male, you have females, you have officers of color coming in, that they have mentors to help them through that process, and make sure that we can retain them and keep them excited about being a police officer. I'm quite sure, when you become a police officer, you don't do it because, it's there. but you do it because you want to protect and serve. So, and going forward for officers coming in new, I would like to see them have a mentor that helps them to navigate the police department.
Okay,
for lack
Chief
of a better
Owens.
word.
Thank you, Renee.
Mhm.
Chief Owens.
Thanks, Ray. Those are two great points. When that was brought up, the initial point about having community members involved in the hiring process, I'm really not sure how that would look in terms of the civil service hiring process. So it's definitely something worth, I think, exploring, but obviously within the state guidelines and the state or the state and city civil service commission guidelines. I don't know at what point we could have an outside person be involved in the interview process, but it's definitely a unique thought and worth exploring. In terms of the hiring, we kind of talked about on one of the prior meetings, or maybe a couple meetings ago, about our recruiting efforts. And the recruiting efforts were to get, first of all, more people interested in taking the test and being eligible to become a police officer, but also that broader diverse group. And those steps we took about 2 or 3 years ago, you're now starting to see that wider pool of candidates so that we can have a more diverse police department. So just obviously diverse by a variety of reasons, their life experience, race, everything. And that's just much better for everyone involved with the community. In terms of recruitment is a challenge. Actually, let me just back up with the hiring too. As much as we did our recruiting efforts, it's also a lot of self-selection. So some people might take the test just to take the test, but in order to move through the process to be hired, they have to want the job. So individuals are as much a part of the hiring process as we are in recruiting a wider pool of candidates. On the retention side, that's definitely a concern in today's climate. I think at times our members don't feel supported, and that can weigh on their decision on whether they want to stay. I think in our favor right now is that we have a very relatively young police department. So most people who are eligible for retirement have already retired. There's very few within that window of retirement. But particular to your comment about minority officers and women, we assign mentors, not in the formal mentor role, but our field training officers kind of cover that. So once they get out of the academy, but particular to both women in policing, because while they're half the population, they're definitely not half the police department in terms of our members. And the minority officers, we informally pair them up with people, but it's just kind of like a natural process. And if they have questions that are particular to some things in their experiences, they can bounce them off another officer who might have a similar background or similar experiences. I can tell you this on the retention side for our minority officers. Some of them, if you were to talk to them one-on-one and they were comfortable sharing, the minority officers at times are subjected to even more, I'll just say, hate-filled comments or lack of support from the community, and they feel it almost sometimes twice as much as the average officer. So we're aware of that, and having gone through this past year, we've talked to those officers, and they've certainly talked amongst themselves, and it's a concern. I think this, as we all talked about all these different things, it absolutely is a matter of trust between the police department and the community. It's a two-way street. We need to build on that. Even when we have differences, we need to be respectful of each other. And like you said a lot of times, and Monica said it, the communication piece. And we have to get better at just being able to talk to people. And we have to build in those chances to have those talks. One of the good things about the North Central Community Group, we've had a lot of these conversations already amongst that small group. And how do we bring that out and share some of the good work we've done together with the wider community of Troy?
Are there other thoughts around the personnel?
Tamara?
Yes.
I know it was talked about earlier, but certainly having a community police officer in each of the zones in terms of the budget, hiring, as the chief mentioned, you can have 2 patrol officers come onto the force, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be assigned to the community police unit. So, so it's important, I believe, to have a community police officer in each of the zones. And as the chief said, it's not just walking the beat. They attend neighborhood meetings. They work with code enforcement on issues. They're an all around community, almost liaison / police officer.
So that would be an example of something that would require additional resourcing and budget to look into that. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, Laura?
So on hiring and recruitment, this kind of goes into the next bullet underneath it, wellness. I know at probation, we get a lot of interest in the test and being a probation officer just from the people who already work there, who like to work there, and recognizing the need for people with human services background or whatever. So, I mean, I'm sure the police department's the same way. They're a team and all connected and want to complete a mission for a safer community. And they may be your best source to recruit people. So just a thought.
Laura, can I just clarify, were you saying social service background? So are you saying that just so that I
was mentioning that relative to being a probation officer. A lot of what we do is communication, social services, mental health, substance abuse based. So we get a lot of friends of POs are from social services background or different other community organizations.
Okay. So what you were saying is that the police department themselves are going to be a good source of bringing in others.
I would think they could be, yeah.
Okay.
Recruiting friends or people they may have known from school, or could be, like the chief said, it's a young department. So that's all.
Okay. Justin?
Hi. I would just like to say that I would like to see more intentional planning around the greater diversity. I asked the question a few meetings ago about what that process was in terms of trying to, diversify the, police department. I wasn't too happy, just honestly speaking, with the answer I received in terms of, reaching out to certain groups and, hoping that they would, in return, reach out to their members of their churches or, things of that nature. But I would like to see a more intentional plan. Like if we're looking for, more females or more minorities, to join the police department, what is that like? I would like to see a more intentional plan around that.
Chief Owens? Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, Justin. I was just wondering if you had any other examples or some thoughts on how we might be more intentional in that process.
So for an example, thank you, I do actually. For an example, If you are looking for African Americans, you know, there are several groups that focus and serve that particular community. So, you know, what type of outreach has been done to, you know, to that particular community? Is there a relationship that is built? As I said, you know, I worked for a group serving Black and Brown students all over the Capital Region. I was the director of that program, about almost 400 students. And I think I remember maybe Albany County being the only one that they were very intentional with, you know, getting into our programs, knowing that we serve Black and Brown students, because they wanted to make that connection. We have seniors, you know, our goal was to focus on, you know, the transition process. So we had seniors graduating from high school. So, you know, something more intentional. If we're looking for more women, what are those groups that are serving young women? And, you know, how can the police department develop a relationship there where there's conversation and communication, you know, for that. So that's what I mean by, I hope I answered that question, Chief, for you.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. So we need to be broader in our connections with other groups. So we do have our cadet post, which brings in young people and can maybe give them, if they have an interest in potential law enforcement careers, whether it's police, corrections, probation, parole. Last year, obviously with COVID, was different, but in previous years, we'll participate in career days at the high schools, both the public and private high schools, if they have a career day. So things like that. But if there's other more focused groups, then yeah, that's a good idea. We should look at making sure we get the material. We make that same offer that we made to the Troy African American Pastoral Alliance, that if people have an interest in learning some test taking techniques or tips, that we work with the community on that too. So that's a good idea. Thank you.
Mayor.
Justin, you raise a good point. Some years ago when I came into office, I noted very early on the lack of diversity in our workforce. It's not limited to the police department, and there are other departments that are even worse off than the police department in terms of diversity. We've tried a number of things. We've reached out to those that we know that might help us get the word out, but it's become apparent that we just haven't found the right formula to make that happen. I think we did have some success with recruiting individuals to take the police exam, and we saw some success as a result of that. But I've been thinking on this for a while, and I actually had a conversation with Renee this afternoon about it, and I said I wasn't ready to hatch it yet, but here I am making it public. I'm thinking of something along the lines of a diversity and inclusion committee that would include the director of personnel for the city, someone from my office, maybe someone from each of the high schools, maybe somebody from Hudson Valley, who would form a committee for the purpose of coming up with processes or outreach techniques to help us not just get the word out, but encourage people to take the tests that they need to take in order to be considered for city or state employment. I'm having conversations now with the fire department, Lansingburg School District and Troy School District along these lines, and sort of formalizing that process. I don't know yet what it would look like, who all would be included, but I would like to see something, I'd like to see something more formal, because we're not performing. We have good intentions. We tried based on what we know, but we're doing so much else during the course of the day. It's apparent it's not getting enough attention to have the impact we want it to have. So if we have a group that's focused on that can research how others are doing it, that can develop the relationships that are necessary to encourage people to apply. convince them that a career in firefighting or in public safety or in accounting is a good career for them that comes with benefits. So that is in the embryonic stage right now, but it's a very good point. We have not done what I had hoped we would have done by this point, and we need to step up our game in that regard.
Awesome. Thank you, Mayor, for sharing that information.
Thank you, Mayor. Council President?
Yep, I'll be very quick. Just dovetailing what the mayor just said. I've given it some thought also, Mayor, because it has, been raised so many times, not just minorities, but women and the fire department. Obviously, we just appointed a woman, but saying that we need to do a better job, obviously. One of the things I was thinking about, I did look at other municipalities and even some other states. They're actually going into schools at even a younger age because of social media. And one of the things, and there's a quote here by someone, actually a chief, and one of the things that really struck him was that a lot of the students were misled, and they actually had seen so many things on social media, and so their perception of not just becoming a police officer, but their perception of police officers was just so negative. And so to get back to what the chief said, communication, Renee has said it, so many people have said it all along, but I'm thinking if somehow we could, even at an earlier age, I know that we're trying, through our colleges and, obviously we can't hire a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, but maybe if we could have our police officers just go in and talk to our students and maybe parent-teacher associations and things like that, it might be some good groundwork. Just some thoughts.
Thank you, Carmela. Do we have other thoughts around the workforce development, or should we move to transparency? Okay, why don't we go to the theme of transparency?
Tamara?
Hi, Kevin.
So we heard frequently from affinity groups, several affinity groups, about their hopes for a police objective review board that was more representative of communities of color. And secondly, they spoke often about subpoena powers. And I need to be educated currently about the objective review board, and does that have subpoena power? And how does that work if it does?
I think that's for me to answer. So the police objective review, let me start again. The police objective review board that we have on the books was created in 1997. The legislation is all of 2 1/3 pages. So there's not much detail in there. And it has, unsurprisingly, stumbled since 1997. It does not include any structure in the legislation. So there's not even a way to appoint a chair of the committee. There's no details about meetings, about minutes, about process. So I took some time this summer and I wrote a set of operating procedures for the group. And it ensures that there is a process for choosing leadership by the group members, not by me, not by the police chief. that there's a succession process as to how new members are chosen. There are rules for how meetings are convened, who chairs the meeting, who gets to be involved in discussions, who doesn't get to vote on it, because the procedure does include non-voting membership for a member of the police department, a member of the union, and the city corporation council. So I wrote very clearly what their roles were and what they weren't. I did recruit members for the board. I've forgotten, I think there are 8 members on the board, which is strange to have a board with an even number of members, but that's the way the legislation is written. They do not have subpoena power. There are a number of different styles of police review boards, probably 5 different major categories and countless iterations of each. We have a style that reviews the disciplinary procedures that the department undertakes. It is, where else did I want to go? Okay, so the membership, I recruited members last year. I don't know the race of all of the members, but if you twisted my arm and forced me to guess, I'd say it was 6 African-American members and 2 white members, split, I think, fairly equally between men and women. We should have been up and running by now. I take full responsibility for that. We had planned to do our training. It's fairly extensive training that's required for the members. We had planned to do that in the fall. Everybody had agreed they were comfortable meeting in person to do that. And then the COVID surge occurred. We had several members of the police department get COVID. I got COVID. I'm just not comfortable bringing people together physically, so we're reworking the training process so it can be done on Zoom. I think this plan will be the hold my feet to the fire in terms of setting a date by which we will commence and complete the training, and a date by which we'll get off the ground. Everything is ready to go. We just have not, I don't want to blame it on COVID, but in fact, we got knocked off the track a bit by COVID, and it's been hard to get back on. And recently, most of my attention has been devoted to the PRRC. So we're ready. We're just about ready to go. That's where it stands right now. Does that answer your questions, Kevin?
Yeah, yes, it does. So thank you. Particularly around the racial composition. The whole matter of subpoena and subpoena power. What's your response to that, Patrick?
Well, I don't have that authority to do that. That's not in the legislation. And I think that once you get into subpoena power, it opens a whole nother can of worms in terms of resources, staffing, much more intense training, and it necessarily moves the implementation much further down the road. My view is, let's start what we have. Let's create a process whereby on a semi-annual basis, we get a report from the committee, what's working, what's not working, and make modification to make it work as best we can for the needs of this community. Too often what I've seen, and I think it is exactly what happened in 1997, somebody thought we needed a review board, and so they looked one up that some other community had, and they did a global replace Troy for whatever community they had. It was not necessarily responsive to the needs that we have here, the particular needs on the ground here. So I don't want to repeat that mistake. I'd like to run with what we have, see how it works or doesn't work, and make amendments if to that which is not working. The council may feel differently than I do, but that's my position at this time.
Thank you, Patrick.
There are other thoughts about the objective review board, the other areas of transparency, the complaint process. We heard quite a bit from Chief Owens about sharing information and the data and the metrics, getting some of that up and running. Mayor.
So Renee's account of her experience is disturbing. I think it's disturbing to everybody here. And I'm wondering, you know, we talk about the complaint process as just a place you go to complain, to lodge a complaint against somebody. And I'm wondering, you know, as I think about those two things in my head at the same time, I'm wondering if, you know, I think about my experience. I recently purchased a vehicle, and, you know, I got 16 surveys afterwards, and, you know, cards to fill out and this and that. How did we do on this and that and that and this? You know, I know that is problematic. You know, how did we do when we gave you your ticket for speeding on Route 2 or whatever? You know, we're probably going to get some skewed responses, but I'm wondering if there isn't a way to sort of assess at least some aspects of our interactions with individuals, so we can begin to build an understanding of how we are interacting with the public. The two issues that Renee brought up were not the result of systemic racism. That wasn't a system. That was an individual. And we need to know if individuals are acting in that fashion and need to be spoken to or disciplined more severely. It's difficult because, like I say, if you're pulling somebody over, they're going to be angry because they got a ticket, even if they were speeding or even if they did run a red light. And I don't want to see a situation where officers, that is held against officers because they work in the traffic detail and everybody's angry at them. But I want to, and I'll speak with others about this, but I'm trying to find a way, one, to see if we can get more real-time response from the community about, at least about our courtesy when we interact with people. And I know that the chief is working on an easier complaint process that also includes a process by which you can compliment an officer. So, you know, if you are so inclined and you acknowledge that, yeah, I ran the red light, but the guy, you know, he was really nice to me, although I still got a ticket. You know, we'd like to hear if our officers are doing well, too. And I think, you know, this is something that probably warrants discussion across all of city employment, not just the police department, but we're talking about the police department tonight. So I just wanted to throw those thoughts out there. And if people want to feed on those thoughts and add to them or expand upon them, I'd be grateful for your input.
Does anyone have thoughts on that? Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think that finding the mechanisms is a challenge in what you're saying, but evaluating performance shouldn't just be internal. It should be from the users of services. We do that all the time with our tenant and guest satisfaction surveys, and they're really meaningful to us, and they also help us to develop a baseline and make improvements over time. I also do think that, yeah, complaints kind of heavy for some things. I think some feedback would be, you know, the officer could have been more courteous in the situation, or indeed was, and making that easier too. So I don't know the answer for that. I assume other departments do such things. And it'd be interesting to canvas to see how the community gives that feedback on a more frequent basis.
So Kevin, are you suggesting breaking it apart, the complaint and the feedback piece might be two different mechanisms?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
I love the idea, Patrick. I don't know if I want to say more than that. I love the idea. I think it's like an evaluation of the performance. I mean, like I said, if I was filling those out, I'd have lots of good things to say. But I think if it can be done in a way that's neutral, you really start to get a sense. Not everybody's going to fill it out. You're more likely to get the really positive and the really negative. That's kind of the way those things are. But that might be what you want.
Thank you, Chris. Kathy?
I like your idea, Mayor, and we had some experience in mental health services a few years ago where we actually used some college students to do outreach to persons who have received services, and actually had structured phone interviews with the individuals. And in that way, we were able to connect with folks who may not ordinarily fill out a survey or to reach out. So it was kind of a random sampling that we did, and did outreach and used students to do that in a way that really didn't cost us much money to do, but the students were able to make a research project out of it, actually. So that may be a food for thought.
Thank you, Kathy. DA Donnelly?
I apologize if this was already said. My family came home, so I had to relocate. But I think it could be as simple as just an opportunity for a complaint to be filed either by telephone, email, and just, I think if resources were dedicated to responding to that in short order, I think that would go a long way. I don't know if that's something to consider. I'm quite certain that the chief and the deputy chiefs have plenty to do, but if we're talking about thinking outside the box, if there was a person who was assigned to, provide an in-person response to a complaint in short order, I would imagine that would, I bet, a good half of them would be satisfied with a response. So just something to think about.
Thank you, Justin. And then
I was just gonna tag along with Mary Pat. That's exactly what I was gonna say. I think a lot of times people put in complaints and they don't hear anything back. So they're assuming that nothing is being done. And so I think if there was some type of system set up where people are actually, hearing from the police department about the complaint that was put in, I think that would help also with, building that trust that I'm putting something in and they actually are caring enough to look at what I put in and respond, back to me. It's like asking a question and not getting an answer back, so I think a system like that would be great.
thanks, Justin. Ken?
Yeah, actually, it's almost the point I was going to make. I think I'm going to just give an example from my second or third career, which is I'm an ice hockey referee, and there's a great deal of parallels between officiating a sport and policing. In that, of course, you're trying to enforce rules, and you've got a lot of people that really don't like what you're doing. Ice hockey officials, I think any group of people that are doing something where you're subject to criticism, there's a tendency to want to become insular and protect your fellow, in my case, your fellow officials from criticism. I think that's any group of people that are subject to such criticism. And so we have, with officiating, I mean, I know, like when an official makes a mistake, a lot of times, officials will band together and say, well, he's doing the right thing, or, no one understands how difficult it is or whatever. But when you take that out of the hands of the officials and put the feedback loop into either the public or maybe coaches or an independent body of coaches, officials, and players, or something along those lines, you tend to get a more reasonable resolution to concerns. So I guess where I'm going with this is with the police. We've all heard it. We've heard when there's a complaint filed or people have an issue with something that happened, and they say, well, the police are just investigating themselves. They're never going to find anything wrong. And so that breaks trust down. And in order to build trust, we want, and of course, we're in the category of transparency. You want to build transparency into the feedback process. Now, I'm not saying, I don't think necessarily that if we have an online form that makes it really easy to submit feedback, that should just be public. Obviously, there's personnel and privacy concerns with some of that, but I also don't think that the feedback should necessarily just go to Chief Owens and Deputy Chief DeWolf. Maybe feedback would go to the Police Objective Review Board as well, and also maybe go to the mayor. Just a few folks that can all kind of cogitate on that feedback, and then of course have a singular point of response to the complainant. But I think it was maybe it was Kevin that was talking about, or Chris was saying that there should be two different levels, like a complaint level and a feedback level. I think it's all, a complaint is feedback. It's just negative feedback. So I think, if we call it feedback and just make that feedback easily accessible, and again, not just make it going to a singular point where there's multiple interested parties can review the feedback, discuss it, and then respond appropriately. I think that would help build trust in that entire process.
So somehow linking the complaint process to some of the work that needs to be done around data and metrics and sharing information, figuring out what needs to be shared and who it, okay.
Yep, exactly. And I think the PORB, the Objective Review Board would also play a role in that. I would think that if we have an automated complaint system, the members of the PORB should probably receive that. I'm guessing that they have to take an oath that they're not going to divulge personal information about officers, that they have to conduct themselves professionally.
Okay. Other thoughts about transparency before we move to the next? All right, I'm looking at the time, so why don't we go ahead and go over to the prevention and the connection. There was a lot of feedback in this category from the affinity groups and also from email responses. So going back to our questions, what do you see as a committee as the near term and the longer term priorities in these areas? And I think this is an area where is there something that your agency can bring, to the table to help with this?
Hey, Tara.
Yes.
Very quickly, I apologize, to go back to transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to mention, body cams will be in place any day now, that's a huge transparency move, and obviously the policies with that. So just a thought.
I will add that too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that one's interesting because body cams are listed under policy procedure because there are policies that go along with body cameras, but they also are a transparency solution.
And then the question becomes, how is the information shared? So it's belongs there, yes. Renee? Did I see Renee's hand go up?
I thought Renee said she had to leave a while ago. Maybe she came back.
I did too, but then I thought she popped up. Let me just look. Okay. Kevin?
So in the prevention connection, there are several here. I think there are several members on this group that would like to participate on some level. Clearly, some sort of either co-respondence or a triage response approach to mental health, and you know, our involvement in with the DA Donnelly's reentry programs certainly enhance those more, and secure its funding, definitely. And I also want to comment and recall Patrick Doyle's comment about open dialogues, that he had open dialogues with the police on one occasion, perhaps. He'd like to see more of them. And that might be an interesting place for the procedural justice education to occur. And not just Boys and Girls Club, but other, use that model and spring that model out, and maybe have that for pop-up kind of open dialogues throughout the city. But I was intrigued by that open dialogue that he referred to.
Thank you, Kevin. So you're thinking putting that with like the Boys and Girls Club, they could be a conduit for some of that procedural education.
They could be one of them. Yes.
Okay.
With the reentry programs in particular, I remember talking about the fact that I can't remember her name, the woman who has 175 people on her caseload. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name. But anyway,
Casey.
Thank you. Who does a remarkable job. But her job could be made easier if there was more availability of affordable housing, or even any housing at all that's an option for people, and also employment programs. And Unity House and others that we work with, I know would be interested in helping in those arenas. There are definitely funding opportunities out there to help with both employment opportunities and affordable housing. And both of those as well, employment and affordable housing, I think are more generically part of the prevention answer. If we accept the premise that, you know, dealing with poverty alone is an underlying part of what sometimes leads to crime. So having a safe place, an affordable place to live, and having an opportunity to get a decent job, you know, help both generically as well as directly with the reentry programs.
Thank you, Chris. Kathy and then Laura.
Just wanted to follow up with Kevin's comment regarding mental health and mental health supports. There are several ways that we can look at mental health and law enforcement in terms of diverting completely from law enforcement and intervening before the call ever comes to law enforcement. There's also supports to involve mobile crisis or other services like mobile crisis while law enforcement is intervening. And one person spoke that was on February 10th in my notes here, about the STAR program in Denver, Colorado. I did look that up. It is, I think, very similar to what is being suggested right now in Bill S 4814 that Carmela had mentioned. I looked that legislation up and have read what's being proposed. It is sort of a first responder paramedic-like behavioral health response in the community. The STAR model in Denver, Colorado is like that. So I think there are many different ways that we could consider how mental health could be interfacing to give support and also relief to law enforcement in responding to mental health calls.
Thank you, Kathy. Could I get the name of that bill in the chat, or I can also look it up?
That was S 4814. There's an assembly bill linked to it, which I don't have that number.
Okay, thank you.
Hold on, I can look it up right now. 4814.
Thanks, Carmela.
You got it. It is Assembly 4697. And just so folks are aware, this is all in response to the Rochester incident. It's called Daniel's Law.
Thank you. Laura?
I think this might fall under diversion programs, but I know the city of Troy started to address the trauma issue, trauma in neighborhoods into individuals and responding better to crime victims. People who've experienced trauma, take an incident and could be retaliation issues. There could, just springboards into other things. So we did start to talk about how to go in and triage trauma incidents in neighborhoods. So I think that would be worth taking a look at and starting. Yeah, I mean, we haven't really heard much about approach to crime victims. So we didn't hear anything really about a response to crime victims. So a lot of people we have at probation, even though they're on probation, have been crime victims in some way. So we have to be aware of that as a mental health issue and just responding to behavior issues. So I just wanted to mention that. And when dropping down to the youth activity community spaces, I think it would be helpful if we actually had more of a youth voice. I know Patrick represented youth interests, I think, and their organization handles that very well. But as we start to develop the youth activity piece in the city of Troy, I think hearing from youth would be beneficial.
Thank you, Laura. So I'm looking at the time. We're at about 18 after 8, and I know we're going to talk again on Wednesday. Is there anything else in this area for this evening?
Tamara?
Yes.
Very quickly, I was looking through my notes. I just wanted to make sure that we have somewhere in there language barriers. I'm not sure where we should put that. Maybe policy. I'm not sure, but it did come up a couple times.
So I'll put it under policy for right now, and then we can explore where we want it to land ultimately. Okay, that's a good place. Okay, so I think we have a good start. What I'll do is take this and clean this up a bit and get it back out to the committee, and we can continue to work work on this on Wednesday evening. And we will have some focus around under the personnel, the workforce development again. Fred Miller will be coming. He's going to come to the committee meeting around 6:45, and he's planning to be with us for about a half an hour or so. So he will come and speak. Are there any other thoughts before I turn it over to the mayor? Actually, let's just look quickly at the upcoming schedule. So we added a committee meeting for this Wednesday from 6:30 to 8. And then you can see the plan development will continue in early March. The goal is to have a plan out for review by the public by around 3:15, to have that finalized and then presented to the city council for ratification before the 4th of April. So I will go ahead. Oh, Ken.
Yeah, I guess we don't capture this in a category, but a lot of people have been sending articles to me about what other municipalities are doing with their plans. Is there a place where we can capture some of those, some of the links to the articles? Does that play into this at all, or do we not want to look at other municipalities?
I think if you see something that you think is relevant to the work that we're doing, if you send it on to us, we can get it sent out to the committee.
Okay.
Have them look at it before we come together on Wednesday.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
That'd be great. Mayor, I think I'll turn it back over to you. We're at about 8:20.
Okay. Thank you, Tamara. I thought tonight, I've got a lot of notes. I thought tonight was a very good dialogue. And it expanded some of the thinking that I've had that's helpful. Thanks, Chris, thank you for pushing what may have been an uncomfortable topic, but those are the topics we need to push and have conversation around. So I guess that's it for now. Thank you for everybody for engaging in the dialogue, even when it wasn't comfortable. And sorry if I embarrassed you, Chris, by singling you out. But, let's keep this up. This has been great, and it's very helpful to beginning to see the outlines of a plan here. Like I said, it's not going to conclude on April 1st. I like the conversation around the last column, prevention and connection. I like the way people stepped up and were interested in several of those topics. That will be an important byproduct of this process, which brought you together to cross-fertilize on issues that can make our community a safer, more welcoming community and a more compassionate community as well. So again, thanks. I can't stop saying that enough. So at this point, I'll just say good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.